All right, welcome to the review. We got a lot of slides I want to get through. So I'm not going to take my time and explain each slide. It's more to just to go through the highlights of this, give you a reminder of what we kind of covered. And then if I go too fast, you of course can easily stop the slide if you need to get more information on it. So that said, let's jump in. The first film that we saw after the midterm was Dr. Strangelove. Kubrick is American, but chooses to work in England. It's a political satire, black comedy. Kubrick begins as a photographer. Some of his other films, Clockwork Orange, 2001 Space Odyssey, gotta watch it. Shining and Full Metal Jacket, all great work. Satire versus comedy. Comedy, just trying to make you laugh. Satire, you're going to laugh, but it also wants you to think. And that's certainly the case with this movie, this topic, which is nuclear annihilation. Some of the dialogue, of course, is brilliant. It's interesting to see how the characters are acting, reacting. Cinematography is extraordinary. Here, Kubrick does a couple of black and white films, but then when he does move into color, they too are extraordinary. Shining, incredible, and it's this brilliant use of saturated color, and there's none of that here in the black and white. It's still phenomenal. You can take a look at him working here. I like this shot because it shows how the camera's mounted, and he's actually up there working, not just having a cinematographer do his work for him. There are no women here in the war room. We talked about that. We talked about how thousands of years ago, even the Greeks had divided power between men and women, kind of taking a step back there. And then he even goes one step further by this being the only female character in the film. Acting brilliant. Peter Sellers, 3 different roles, all radically different. Great acting. George C. Scott, he goes on to do Patton, brilliant actor. And then Sterling Hayden, and again Peter Sellers here. This is Slim Pickens. And the editing for our film is functional, right on point. Tell the story, does a great job. Dialogue here is brilliant, and some of the lines, of course, are classics now. So the next film that we saw was Little Big Man, and that was directed by Arthur Penn, who had just finished Bonnie and Clyde. Dustin Hoffman here, and this too is satire, and it's written to ridicule Custer, and it's speaking very directly to American imperialism, and it's speaking to America in the Vietnam War. There's a division at this time between people in power and the establishment, and the counterculture tend to be liberals, and these themes come up in the movie. It does have a clear social conscience. Many of our films did, and it was one of the first ones that embraced the Native American philosophy. And this went very directly in counter to Nixon's kind of Eisenhower world. The story itself, the structure is interesting because the protagonist moves through both camps, both sides, if you will, and it's a interesting way to tell this the story and to cover these metaphors, which was very much how crazy the world was in the 60s. Cinematography is sophisticated, extremely well done and shot. Our acting here, your primaries are Hoffman and then Chief Dan George. And what they do for one of the first times is actually cast Native Americans in Native American roles. If you watch older westerns, a lot of times it's just white guys in paint. So from there we went to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. That came out in 75, directed by Milos Forman. Do watch Amadeus if you get a chance. That's a brilliant film of his as well. He's Czechoslovakian. Both his parents die in concentration camps. And then he's chased out of Prague. So he's really familiar with authoritarian regimes. And that's what the institution is in this film. So it represents these very severe authoritarian political societies. So the novel is written by a gentleman named Ken Casey, and there's a good documentary on Netflix about him if you want to learn a little bit more about him. But he's one of the first people that bring in the counterculture in the early to mid-60s. He creates the Merry Pranksters, and we see this homage to the bus here in Foreman's movie. So your themes here are fighting those in control and asking why. Those were themes of the 60s counterculture. Humans versus the institution. When is a human no longer human? This is how the movie ends, and it was one of the questions that were on the discussion board. Great writings from y'all on that. Does win 5 Academy Awards. I'm not usually a fan of that being an indicator of how good a movie is or not, but when you win 5, you're doing something right. And it was even nominated for a 6th on cinematography. And then you look at this one, satire, and compare it back to Little Big Man, and the difference here is that you have a rebellious character in McMurphy. So he's taking a step in being active and brings a lot of action to his rebellion and his disobedience. There's 2 medical terms in the film, electroshock therapy and then a lobotomy. And then both things happen, obviously, to McMurphy. And the last being the lobotomy. And that's where they take out part of the brain. And they left him physically intact, but not mentally intact. And that begs the question of when are we no longer human? And isn't intelligence and being aware of one's consciousness part of being human? Unfortunately, still being used today. Cinematography, excellent. Great performances here by Nicholson, but also from Louise Fletcher. She has a really tough role to play, and she's just brilliant at it. We had our metaphors, our visual metaphors here with water and life, and that's that power of that brings that closing scene together. And then the most important moral question here is, when do we stop being human and we just are a vegetable? Up next, we saw Run Lola Run. We really looked at editing, our music, the role it plays, time and the manipulation of time, kind of free will versus determinism, and it's one of our first non-traditional narrative arcs. So we covered linear time, that's the length of the movie, and then story time, what's happening within the time frame of the movie. It gets manipulated, obviously, to a severe degree here. And we're looking now at time and how it's manipulated, and the sophistication of that now, taking this long to really develop into this in this kind of storytelling. We revisit the traditional story arc, and what we see in Run Lola Run is this compressed, and then 3 of those in a movie combined to create one overall arc that has 3 complete story arcs in it. So I asked you to think about what the film said about love. What does it say about fate? Showing different outcomes for the same issue. And then how the filmmaker very cleverly is using the sense of urgency. It's embedded in the narrative. We see lots of clocks, cameras are moving, she's running. It's just full of energy. Great, great, great cinematography, even a little touch of animation in there. We talked about how quick the cuts were here, almost 1,500 cuts, and then explained a little bit about the difference between external rhythm and internal rhythm. So external rhythm is when I make an edit, I make a cut in the film. Internal rhythm is the rhythm within the frame. So how long do I stay on a shot as she's running towards me? All of that's internal rhythm. Now when I cut and I go to an above angle and now she crosses, the cut is external rhythm, and they work together, and they work together very well in this film. Brought in an old picture of how it used to be cut, frame by frame by frame, with razors, and they were extremely cumbersome. Acting, she did a fantastic job, and you can tell because she has to bring each of the characters' experience in each of the 3 mini stories. Different things happen, and she's required to perform at a different level. Did a great, great job. And there's one of our cell animations. Next up, we saw Pulp Fiction, American film. This too, we looked specifically at the manipulation of story time within the narrative. Writer-director Tarantino. Graphic violence, we talked about that, excessive language in terms of racist language. Tarantino's writes this way all the time, and he's looking for, doesn't mean he always gets it, but he's looking for an authentic and lengthy dialogue. He's trying to replicate that which he hears in real life. Amazing cinematography, great use of sound. It's a non-traditional story arc, and back to our traditional story arc. And then here's the reason it's non-traditional, and we went through all of the sequence and how they are actually out of order, because Vincent gets killed 2/3 of the way through the movie, yet reappears and then walks off into the sunset. Showed you the film in sequences as it would be laid out if it was told chronologically. And then we looked at, is that the same movie? So same actors, same lighting, same shooting, same editing, but I'm just going to rearrange how I tell the story. Is it the same movie? Of course it's not. Cinematography is spectacular. Acting, quality performances from everybody in it. Editing is pretty restrained actually for the pace. It's not like Run Lola Run. It does take a back seat to the story. Popular music used throughout, both as soundtrack and then part of scenes that the actors are in. Great sound effects. Then we talked about his movies, and Jean-Luc Godard, the French New Wave guy, said it's not blood, it's red. And then we put up a quote. I put up a quote from Tarantino's response to this. Tarantino stops answering this question. You won't be able to find much on it today. He thinks that he said it with this kind of a statement. It is what it is. It's art, and it's cinema, and that violence doesn't work its way into everyday life. And 20 years ago, I think he's right in making that statement. Today, I'm not sure if I'd agree with him. Then we went to Spain. We saw work from our Mexican director, Del Toro, an amazing visual director. It's a dark fairy tale, takes place in post-Civil War Spain. Franco, who's a fascist and a dictator, has taken over, taken control of the country, and he actually remains in power for a long time, up into the mid-70s. So it is a fairy tale in the sense it's a story about good versus evil. The fairy tales are visual metaphors and symbolisms, what the captain represents, that brutal dictatorship and fascist political system. And it is a common hero tale in that usually that hero has to overcome or succeed in 3 different journeys. This is Del Toro's work. This is what Jack says about Ophelia and why fairy tales are important, and it's a softer way to examine some of the harsh adult realities. We looked at this statement from the academic in this article, and she's putting forth an argument that says storytelling and disobedience to totalitarianism is a vehicle for resistance to oppression, and that puts a weight on our films. But I think you can go all the way back to Bicycle Thieves, and it fits in this description quite well. So it is a story about rebellion, Ophelia. So we have, again, a strong female protagonist, even though she's a kid. She is questioning authority, and she is rebelling. Labyrinth explained visual metaphors, and then what fascism is. Cinematography, Del Toro just has a way, and the worlds that he creates in the camera are magical. There's no doubt about it. Brilliant. Great editing as well. Wonderful performances that he gets out of his actors. And good use of sound as well. So from there we left, and we went to India. We explored documentary world. 2004, American pair that directs this, and then what Xana does to help these kids in the brothels. So what's different about documentaries? The story works in a traditional story arc, so we go back to that. But what changes is how the film develops, and there's a lot more unknowns in the documentary, and then the post-production, the editing process, takes on a greater role. We know what the story is because we saw it. India itself, an ancient civilization. Just so many people. It's a very different world. This takes place in Calcutta. The city itself, 4.5 million people. Half of our states don't have 4.5 million people in them. It shows you the size, and they're jammed into the city. Went over the term for absolute poverty, and then realizing that in that world, prostitution is one of the few ways to survive. It's sad, obviously, but it's true, and it makes for a very different world. And we see how they go about shooting this. She says in the opening of the film that she knows that she's not going to be able to get the real story of the brothels and these kids if she as an outsider is filming it. And that's where the idea to let the kids tell their own story with cameras comes to her. We don't have actors in documentaries. We do have voiceover. She does a lot of voiceover, and she does a lot of on-camera interviews. Kids themselves, it's just heartbreaking that they don't all make it, right? Editing plays a stronger role in story development and structure in terms of when it's compared to a feature. A feature has every script, every line all mapped out. Everybody knows where we're all going. In the documentary, we don't know what people are going to say, and that's going to change how we tell the story once we get to the edit bay. Sounds are very important. The street sounds, the grittiness of where these kids are, and then sometimes just their pure joy because they're kids, all lends a very important hand to the story. So then we ask some philosophical questions. Again, can art influence change? Can film influence change? Do some filmmakers have a responsibility to tell stories like this? And do we have a responsibility to watch them? And if we don't, how does the world get changed? Then, this week's film, Fantastic Mr. Fox. So you probably just saw these slides, but we'll go through them again. American director, Wes Anderson. Animations, and this one works like the regular story structure. This is a traditional story arc. We have our protagonist, the antagonist. Protagonist has to overcome obstacles to get to a climactic event. We go back to this in the animation. But what does change is how an animation is filmed. In this case, it's either hand-drawn frame by frame, or it is filmed snap frame by frame by frame. It's a laborious process. You need to have good patience skills there. Sorry about the typo there, but here's our story. You saw the film. I'm sure you remember what it was about. It comes from a book, a childhood book of Anderson and his brother. And the important thing here is to remember that there aren't any accidents. Everything that we see in this world is created by hand. But it uses all the same conventions that we see in both documentary and feature. So how a shot is framed up, shallow depth of field we have here, colors, textures, all the things that we would see in a feature film, Anderson is porting over to the animated world. Did a quick calculation for you, point being 8 days to shoot 18 seconds of film. A lot of work, a lot of patience. Cinematography, same composition, same blocking. So how he blocks the puppets is how we would go about blocking actors. Acting, great, well done. In this film, all the audio, the whole soundtrack with the actor's dialogue is recorded, and then the animators are animating to what's been pre-recorded. Great, lovely, again, lovely cinematography. Editing, frame by frame by frame by frame, incredible piece of work. Everything's planned out to the frame before they begin. Great use of sounds for the actors, sound effects to bring the world alive, and then here's somebody just working on the puppets. And then finally, this is the last slide. We're done with the final review. Just take a look at all the countries we've been to. We've been around the world with our films, and at the same time as we've moved around the world, we've watched how they've developed and the sophistication of cinema. So that's what will be on the final hop over there and take it now while that stuff is fresh in your mind. Good luck and cheers.